repeat what you just said, you bowl of shit salad.
Sir, Miniature Dork Universe sucks, sir!
You gotta be shitting me, scumbag. Like and subscribe. Your painting and modeling skills are as bad as your mama's breath. Now you best like and subscribe to that channel, or I'm gonna wrap your nuts around your head. Now are you gonna like and subscribe or what?
Sir, negative, sir!
You better take that back, turtle head.
I'd rather have my nuts wrapped around my head again than like and subscribe to that shitty channel!
Hello once again, and welcome back to another highly evolved round of Miniature Dork Universe. As mentioned, we'll be covering the Crossfire mini scenarios that are available for free on Steven's Balogun blog. So I'll leave the links for that down below so that you can grab these for yourself if you want to. Initially, I had planned to do like an after action report using one of the scenarios here, but the game I played against myself was pretty boring, so I'm not going to put you through that. Instead, I'll just show you the rules and use some of my footage from the boring game to sort of supplement that. So, without going on at length, let's get on with it. This is what you get when you download the PDF from Steven's blog. There's a multi-page document. So here's sort of the glossary of what's inside, and then the scenarios. The first scenario is called the woods, I think, or the forest or something. It got cut off for some reason. The woods, there you go. And then the second one here is the hill. They provide a map for each one. Number 3 is the farm, which is the one I did. The river, the crossroads, and the town. Also included is a mini campaign, the mini Volkov Pocket. That's an East Front campaign, and you can almost play it like a tournament, and they give examples of how this is done and how to set up the tables. Notes on the figures, what you need to collect, and then a lot of notes on the terrain and the maps for each one of the scenarios. So it's very extensive, and here's some more charts, and on the last page there's links to other Crossfire resources. So it's overall an excellent PDF, and I recommend it. Let's look at the maps again in a little more detail. So each one, you can see there's a red line behind which the defender can deploy, and I do believe that the red numbered terrain features just indicate where you can deploy your hidden defenders. I think I couldn't find anything in there. I might have read over it, but I'm sort of thinking that's what that is. And then of course the blue line is where the attacker can deploy. So once again, number 1 is the woods, and that entire game is just going to be forest features. Number 2 is the hill. As you see in the middle, the feature number 2 in the defensive zone is the hill. So you have to be creative how to come up with the hill for this game. And then number 3, the farm. You have a road, you have a bunch of smaller forest features, some fields, and a farmhouse. Number 4, the river. The lower half, there's a river right around where the attackers deploy. And you have a bunker, you have some larger forest areas, a building, a road, a bridge, and then that little symbol off to the side is a ridge. So again, you have to be creative how you translate that ridge onto your game table. Number 5 is a crossroads, and once again there's a building, a bunker, there's more ridges, and this one has an orchard down in the lower right corner, and yeah, several smaller forest features. And then the final one is the town, which has a lot of buildings and some walls, forest features, and roads. But as I mentioned before, I chose to go with scenario number 3, which is the farm. And I took about a week I already had a lot of the terrain features, so I just needed to make a few things. I needed to make the 6x4 fields. I needed to make some little footprints to put under the trees that were roughly 4 inches in diameter. I'll show you the map scale later, how all that works. And I made a footprint for the barn just to make it scenically pretty, but I already had the walls and the roads in the barn. And then I threw in some other little, scenery details just to make it look nice. But they also add like actual terrain features that your stands can have cover behind and that kind of thing. Here's the actual page for the farm scenario. So included on each scenario is a map of the game, the pre-game preparation, and then the forces available to both the defending and the attacking player, and the deployment and the victory conditions. They're giving it a 1 hour time limit, but I suppose that's up to the people playing. It's a pretty small game, so it's likely you'll finish before an hour. And here's how my table ended up looking. This is my interpretation of this map. So like I said, I had to make the fields. I had fields, but they were more kind of randomly shaped, less boxy than this. So I made some fields, and then where the little tree clusters are, I'll show you later how the trees are scaled out and parceled out, and how they sort of parcel out the terrain per each game. So in this game, there was 5 features that were sort of 4-inch forested bunches, I guess you could say. So roughly that's a 4-inch circle, and then the trees are just plopped on it, and that just represents a fairly thick wooded area that would block line of sight and provide some cover. I had the roads, I had the walls already in the farm. So I added things like the shell craters. There's a little hay holder for livestock and a derelict tractor. And then down in the sort of left half, in that kind of no man's zone where nobody deploys, is a destroyed universal carrier. And that's one of my home rules. I like having the derelict and destroyed vehicles on the table, and I wanted to give them a function. So if you're playing and you have a damaged vehicle from your nationality, whoever you're playing, and you give it to the opponent has to place that damaged vehicle somewhere where there's something that could damage the vehicle. So for example, here it's a minefield. So the opposing player would have to place that in the minefield unless there was some other sort of anti-tank weapon or weapon capable of destroying a vehicle. So it doesn't entirely give away the opponent's hidden position or hidden minefield, but it definitely is a strong clue to your side, the side that, you've given him a vehicle from your country. So your side has a very visual clue that there's something in this area that's bad and dangerous and to go with caution. And so it adds a kind of fun dynamic, but it also gives those cool damaged vehicles like a reason to be on the table other than just, to look nice. And Flames of War and Peter Pig both have a pretty extensive line of these damaged vehicles, and they're great and they're fun to paint up. So it's nice to have something that you can use them for that actually gives them a purpose. Many of the terrain features are pretty straightforward, but if you come across something that you don't understand what it is, there is a terrain key near the end of the PDF document that will show you exactly what you need to know. And it's pretty straightforward. And then there's a table that shows you exactly what terrain features you need for each of the games. So for example, I'm doing the farm. So I need 5 woods that are in a 4-inch circle. And so those 4-inch footprints I told you about earlier, that's why they're there. And I need 4 fields, 4x6, so I had to make those for this game. There's 3 4-inch long wall sections. I think mine were a bit longer, so my wall kind of is longer than what's indicated on the map, but I didn't lose any sleep over it. And there's 1 building, and they give dimensions. I'm not sure if my building has those dimensions. It's a rectangular farm building, so we'll just say that that's good. And then 4 sections of 6-inch road, which I already had. So there's a total of 17 terrain pieces. So it's kind of fun. I had fun building or making up the terrain that I needed. You know, I had a lot of it, but it was fun to make the pieces that I needed to complete this map. And I'm looking forward to doing the other maps, playing some of the other games. It's a nice design challenge and creative exercise to come up with the terrain for a specific map and to make up the things that I don't have. So again, I'm looking forward to doing more of these scenarios. The last comment I have on the terrain is around the ground scale. I think somewhere in here it says Steven's ground scale is 1 to 1,000, which makes this about 600 by 600 meters. I find that a little bit large, so for my purposes, I'm going to say each foot equals 100 meters. So that will give us a 200 meter frontage, which is consistent with what a platoon size defensive frontage would be in actuality. And it worked out pretty well for me. But, you know, do it whatever way you like. Now I'm going to get into the forces I use. So for my scenario, I'm going to set it during Operation Totalize Phase 2, where the Canadian 4th Armored Division came into play. My attacking force is going to be the Lake Superior Regiment of the 4th Armored Division. They were the motorized infantry element of the Canadian 4th Armored Brigade. The defender is going to be elements of the 89th German Infantry Division, which was sent into the area to relieve the 26th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, the Panzer Grenadiers within the 12th SS Panzer Division. We'll start with the defender. So as mentioned, this will be the 89th German Infantry Division. Their morale rating is regular, and their command and control structure is German. Obviously, they're German. So in the Crossfire rules, the Germans, they don't need to have line of sight with their platoon leader to move. So that's different from some of the other nations. Some of them need line of sight to move, and some of them need line of sight to move and to finish a move to their platoon commander. So the Germans don't need any of these. Starting with the support elements, we're going to have a medium machine gun, so an MG42 on a tripod. And I like to base these with 3 figures as opposed to the 2 recommended in the rules, just because the medium machine guns have a larger group of men around it supplying ammunition and that kind of thing. So that's why I do that. In place of the sniper, which is recommended in the scenario, I use a sharpshooter figure. In World War II, platoons were usually issued with 1 or 2 rifles with scopes, and they were in turn parceled out to soldiers that had superior marksman skill. So this single figure you can attach to a squad to increase its firepower. So a regular squad usually has 3d6 firepower, so 3 dice. With a sharpshooter, they have 4, and that just reflects that they have an experienced marksman. They can also ignore some of the penalties for concealment and cover, because these guys can pick you off with a scope. Next, I have a section of 2 IG-18 75mm infantry guns. And they have line of sight to a pre-selected target area. So this is another one of my home rules, and that's indicated by the little platoon leader figure stand up in the corner. That just shows that it's off table, but it has line of sight to something on table. And I do that because on this particular table, there's no good position for an actual artillery observer. And so you can put a hidden marker, these target markers, underneath the terrain features that are zeroed in. And so anyone that goes in there can be fired upon with reactive fire or direct fire if you have initiative. For this game, I limited the kill zone to 2 connected terrain features. For my artillery, I roll for artillery missions, so you can get a total of 12 high explosive and 6 smoke. So here I'm going to roll for my high explosives, and it looks like I just got 4. So you can put the 2 dice with 2 on, or just put 1 with 4 on it. But that just indicates that I've got 4 high explosive artillery missions for this. And then I'll roll for my smoke. Little gray dice, easy to see. And here I got 6 smoke missions, so that's probably a little unrealistic, but we'll go with it. What I used to use before I did my artillery trades are these little cards, and this is how I kept track of my off-table stuff. And so on here, it always had 4 smoke missions and 8 high explosive missions. And then the little box, you know, with the 3, that's a smoke mission, so you get 3 stands per mortar, and you roll 1 dice to get the outcome, and you need more than 3. And then for the high explosive, you can roll 4d6, and it has a kill radius of 1 stand, so anything within 1 stand of your target area gets destroyed. But I like doing these now because I like to build the models, and I also kind of like the randomness of rolling dice for the artillery missions, because it adds that random element to the game, so you don't know the outcome really. The final support element for the defender is going to be a melder, which is German for a messenger or a runner. In World War II, the majority of armies, with the exception of the American Army, lacked a lot of radios, and they relied on messengers or runners instead. So in my game, the runner is almost like a communication link between the platoon commander, or say this heavy machine gun to the fire group leader. They don't have direct line of sight, but when you place the melder, in the case of the Germans with the HMG, now he can fire with the rest of the fire group. German squads can move independently without line of sight to a platoon leader, so you won't need runners or melders to do moves, but they do help with firing, or I also use them as scouts. I'll get into the scouting rules either at a different time or a bit down the road, but also when the runner is attached to a squad, he incurs the same damage as the squad. So if the squad is fired at and pinned or killed, then the runner is too. Now when the runner is moving from one squad to another, or from the platoon commander to a squad, he can only be hit by snipers and sharpshooters. Otherwise, he kind of runs with immunity just to show that he's like, being careful. But he can be killed by snipers and sharpshooters, so you got to watch out for that. Then the defender gets a platoon of infantry. So here there's a platoon commander. I like putting 2 figures on my platoon commander bases. I don't like that single figure weird rectangular base. Plus I like it to look like there's maybe the platoon lieutenant and the platoon sergeant, or the platoon leader's talking to a runner or something. So yeah, that's just a personal choice for me. For the Germans, I have a few other markers too that I add, kind of like the runners. I have guys with Panzerfausts. So when you have one figure on a round base with a Panzerfaust, that just gives a squad like a one-shot try to hit a tank. And then you just take the Panzerfaust off the table. I have some figures that are carrying 2 and 3 Panzerfausts, so accordingly, if you have a guy with 3 Panzerfausts attached to a squad, then that squad can take 3 shots at a tank with a fairly powerful anti-tank weapon. I also have stands with medics on it, so I usually give a company a couple stands with medics. And these guys can move around immune to enemy fire, except in the Pacific. I'm not going to bother having medics because they freaking killed one another, so we're going to leave them out. But for Normandy, for sure, the sides can have medics and they can move around with immunity, and they can help rally. So it sort of signifies, a morale boost when you have medics taking care of your wounded buddies, right? And so they give you like a +1 rally. So if you have a medic and a platoon commander nearby, whatever his platoon commander rating is, some Germans are like a +2, or sometimes, elite units are a +2. But anyway, it's just another modifier to help you rally easier. I just kind of like having it because rallying can kind of suck sometimes. And then I have the 2 prone guys with the MG42s on a stand, and they represent covering fire. They're covering fire markers, and covering fire is part of my rules. It's a new fire type that I've added, so that when you're pinned, you can roll for covering fire to unpin, and that also incurs a 1 die penalty on the guy that shot at you, because you're returning the fire back at him and it's keeping his head down. So all nationalities have the ability to have covering fire, and I represent that with the 2 prone machine gunners of whatever nation, I'm making the army represent. You can also lay down covering fire on a terrain feature, and you don't need it to even roll for that. So you can have covering fire, and then anything in that terrain feature is going to have a 1 die penalty. And tanks can fire covering fire with their coax or their hull machine gun as well, and have the same effect. There's no tanks in these mini scenarios though, so we won't go there. And then finally for the defenders, we have a minefield, and there's a select size for that, I think. And here it says the minefield can be detected with the destroyed vehicle rule, which I showed you earlier. Now we'll move on to the attacking forces. So in this case, it's the Lake Superior Regiment, and they have regular morale and Commonwealth command and control. I'll speed this along by putting all the support elements for the attacker up at once. But we'll start off with the MMG, and in this case it's mounted on a universal carrier. So I said there's no tanks in these scenarios, and this is not really a tank, it's an armored vehicle. But by this time in the war, most of the British and Commonwealth were mounting their Vickers on universal carriers. And then there's an engineer rifle squad. In this case, I just have it as engineer. And these are a mine removal team. And then we have 2 2-inch mortars. Now, the mini scenario calls for 1, but British and Commonwealth platoons usually each had 1. So because there's 2 platoons, I thought I would have 2 2-inch mortars. And in this game, I didn't end up using them that much, but that's more my fault than anything else. And then finally, there is some off-table 3-inch mortars. So I use my off-table trays, and instead of having 1 mortar just sort of depicting a mortar, say a mortar battery, this is a mortar section of 2 mortars, and they have the firepower of 2 mortars. So they would fire 8 dice or throw 8 dice. So that's a lot of dice. But artillery and mortar fire is pretty much the #1 killer on the battlefield. So I'm reflecting this here, and I have rules for cover and concealment. So often if I'm firing against a terrain feature that has cover and concealment, they end up throwing 4 dice anyway because of the penalties. However, if a stand is out in the open, they're going to have the fury of the full 8 dice, and that's reflective of reality. If you're out in the open and you're hit with an artillery strike, you're fucked. And you are in this game, the way I have the rules set up. So that's why that is like that. So yeah, I have the 2 3-inch mortars in support. In the mini scenario, the attacker is supposed to have a light infantry gun, but the Canadians didn't really have light infantry guns. So that's why I've given the attacker the mortars, and the defenders, the Germans, did have the light infantry howitzers. So I just switched it up. And then finally, the attacker has 2 platoons. And I like how it's not a balanced game where it's, a company against a company. I think this is more reflective of reality. And the defender still has a lot of advantages. And in fact, the defender won. Like when I played this game, I have a way easier time defending than attacking. And definitely the combination of the MG42 and the infantry guns were pretty devastating. I gave each platoon a runner, and then there was 1 medic for the 2 platoons. And then as well with the Germans, I use casualty figures. So I have guys surrendering and some, killed figures. Those are used. So 1 represents a pin and 2 represents a suppressed. And I think that's about it. I didn't include any Piats with these guys because the Germans didn't really have any tanks to fire at. But Now that I think of it, a Piat might have come in handy to deal with the MG42 that was in the giant stone barn. It was pretty well protected. I tried using 2-inch and 3-inch mortars against it, but it was very resilient, that MG42. Also, there's a provision in the rules for ground hugging, and to show squads that are ground hugging, I just use a prone figure. So those are these guys up at the front and on the left that are on sort of a rectangular base. They're my ground huggers. That'll do it for the army lists, and as you can see, it's fairly easy to modify them to be specific to whatever campaign you're going to do or whatever figures you have. So as I mentioned before, my game actually turned out kind of boring. I deployed most of the German squads in the woods on the one side of the road, and then I put the MG42 in a barn that was covering a couple of the fields on the left side of the road. And yeah, it was just a slogging match. I had a very difficult time, and then the Canadians, I had the brilliant idea of just advancing one platoon up one side of the road and the other platoon up the other side of the road, which is a bit of a microcosm of the actual battle. The forces were forced to advance down a very narrow frontage. So there was, on phase 2 of Totalized, the Polish 1st Armored Division was on one side of the Caen-Falaise Highway, and the Canadian 4th Armored Division was on the other side, and it was a very narrow kind of kill zone to be moving down, and that's kind of how this game went as well. Painfully historically accurate. So one thing I will talk about before I end this video, though, is how I do initiatives, because in the game one side will have the initiative, usually the attacker, and they can play as long as squads keep succeeding at whatever they're doing, be it moving or shooting or what have you. But I was finding it kind of unrealistic that an entire company could lose initiative because one squad failed to carry out its task. And what I was finding it was doing with my games anyway, and it could just be too because I do a lot more modeling than gaming, so maybe I'm just not great at gaming, but even my opponents were having the same thing happen where hotspots would develop in the game. So you would want to resolve the action in one particular area. You just kind of get drawn to it, and at the expense of all the other units on the table. And so the games were getting kind of lopsided. Not intentionally, just because you get involved in the firefight that's happening. So the way I decided to get around that is to have initiatives are won by platoons. And so the way that works is it does kind of add a turn into the game, and I'm sure this is going to turn off a lot of Crossfire players because the whole point of the game, or one of the main things, is you get away from game turns. But these aren't exactly turns. The way I do it is the player with initiative plays through all of their units. So if you have 2 platoons, like number 1 platoon will move and fire and maybe lose initiative, in their fire, but the second platoon gets to go 2 and move and fire until they're stopped, and either they win the initiative or lose the initiative. But there is a turn, so each squad gets an option to move and fire per initiative unless stopped. And so say you have 2 platoons against 1, as in this game here. Say the German platoon has initiative against 1 Canadian platoon, and then the other Canadian platoon gets initiative over the Germans at the end of that phase. Then there's a tie, and then you just roll to see who breaks the tie, and then the next side would get initiative. So then it's more like the platoons are holding the initiative of the company, not so much just one squad. And it keeps it so that when the player with initiative has to play through both of their platoons in that initiative, you don't end up with that lopsided kind of game where all the action's happening on one side of the table, and then when everyone's either, all the objectives there are taken, or one side is defeated, the other side, then you move, oh yeah, there's all these guys over here. It keeps it kind of balanced, but it's also more like real life, because what I'm calling a turn, which isn't really a turn, I'll call it initiative. It's representing one moment in time. So it's not just one platoon is moving until it gets stopped, and then if you can keep your initiative, then the second platoon can move. It's that in that moment, both platoons are attempting to do what they do, and if the Germans stop the majority of them, then the initiative goes over to the Germans. And if they don't, well, then they keep the initiative, and then it repeats itself. Number 1 platoon plays through, and then number 2 platoon plays through, and then we tally up who's got the initiative at the end of each move, each phase. So I don't know if I've explained that perfectly well here. It might be kind of confusing still, so if that's the case, sorry. But at some point I will demonstrate this, and show you guys what I mean. Because it does work out kind of well. It flows pretty well, and it still has that dynamic of, it's not like I go, you go, I go. The sides still have to maintain initiative. However, there is kind of like a turn, because when the initiative player will play through all of his forces until the end of that turn to determine if he's kept the initiative. And he might go again, or the other side might have taken the initiative. So that being said, however, these small games are really great for testing out home rules or learning the basic rules. And I recommend that if you haven't played Crossfire ever and you're interested in getting into it, before you build these massive armies, you can build a smaller force and play these smaller sized games. And I would recommend just using the basic Crossfire rules at first, just to see how it's going. But it's really great that these guys put these things out free for us. So thank you, Stephen and Dick and Artie, for coming up with the great game in the first place. But I think for now that'll do it. And thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll see you next time for the next round of Miniature Dork Universe.